During the webinar, you may ask those questions in the Zoom group chat. You can access the Zoom group chat by clicking the chat button at the bottom of your screen in Zoom. Any questions that were submitted during your registration for the course have already been submitted to the presenter. Please be aware that if you have your video on, other participants will be able to see you and whatever's behind you. In addition, some tips for the use of Zoom if you have not used Zoom for a webinar before. First, you may have a better user experience if you set your Zoom to speaker view by clicking on the speaker view button in the upper right-hand corner of your screen. You can turn your video on or off in the lower left-hand corner of your screen. And if you need to change your username, you are able to do so by clicking on the 3 dots in the upper right-hand corner of your own video or whatever panel shows your name. If you have any questions about technical issues during the presentation, again, feel free to ask them in the chat area and I will be happy to assist you. And finally, I want to reiterate that we are recording the presentation, the webinar for today, for the use of officials who were not able to participate at this particular time. So your continued participation in the webinar, given that notification, counts as approval for participation in a recording. So now let me turn to our agenda for the day. We expect the webinar to take less than an hour. We will be done momentarily with presentation of ground rules and the introduction of the presenter. Our presenter will present for approximately 20 minutes, perhaps a little bit more, and then we will have another 20 minutes or so for questions. And let me introduce our presenter for the day. We are very excited to have with us today Trudy Henson, who is a public health program director at the University of Maryland Center for Health and Homeland Security at the University of Maryland School of Law. The center is a center which was designed specifically to address the kinds of issues that we are dealing with right now during the COVID pandemic. And so, Trudy, without further ado, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you. I just want to take a minute to thank everyone for inviting me here. I didn't realize this was your first Zoom presentation or webinar, so I'm honored to be here. We're going to keep it kind of high level, and then I want to give everyone really ample opportunity to ask any questions. As Eric mentioned, I have the questions that you submitted with registration, but I'm sure that there are additional questions as well. So we're going to talk about emergency powers and local authority and the interplay of those and the powers and duties that go with both. So next slide. The overview, again, very general. I'm going to talk a little bit about state powers. My sense is that a lot of you are in local government, so you probably are familiar more with your role and what you can and can't do. So we'll talk about the state powers, the governor's emergency powers, and then the county powers and how all of those things are interplaying, particularly some of the issues that we're seeing with COVID-19. Next slide. So to begin with, the states derive their powers from the federal government, and we do that from the US Constitution and the 10th Amendment, which states that the powers that the United States don't claim and that they don't prohibit to the states are reserved to the states respectively. And so we kind of call that the 10th Amendment police power, and we see that discussion a lot. And so where the federal government hasn't claimed those powers, the states have those powers. And within the police power, we see things like public health falling into those police powers. And part of that is because the local governments, the cities, they were regulating public health before there were states and before there was a federal government. And one of the things that we see with this public health power is the articulation of those powers in the case Jacobsen v. Massachusetts. If you'll go to the next slide. And Jacobsen v. Massachusetts is a case that's over 100 years old now. And for those of you that aren't familiar with it, Jacobsen was a citizen of Massachusetts. Massachusetts was experiencing a smallpox outbreak. Massachusetts passed a regulation, particularly in Boston, that required citizens to get a smallpox vaccination. And Jacobsen had had probably by today what we would call an adverse reaction or an adverse event to vaccinations when he was a child, and he did not want to get the vaccination. Now, you could choose to not get the vaccination, but you had to pay a $5 fine, which in today's money is about $132. He didn't want to pay the fine either. So he took it to court, and it went all the way up to the Supreme Court. And the question was really, does the state have the right to infringe upon personal liberty to require a smallpox vaccination or a vaccination? Is that a correct use of the state's power? Next slide. And so although this happened in 1904, this case is continually cited because it really did articulate that power, both the police power of the state and then sort of that balancing that the state has when it is considering public health measures with individuals. So the Supreme Court said, according to settled principle, the power of the state must be held to hold at least such reasonable regulatory power as established by the legislature that will protect the health and public safety. And so that you see a lot of times quoted because it really lays that foundation or articulates the foundation for that public health power of the states. Next slide. And then the Supreme Court goes on to say that the liberty secured by the Constitution of the United States doesn't impart a right, an absolute right in each person to be free in all times and all circumstances. And that's really important when we're talking about public health measures like vaccinations for Jacobsen, or when we're talking about some of the emergency powers that we're seeing exercised at the federal and state level now. This has been reiterated over the 100+ years since this case took place for vaccination cases, as well as other public health measures. So we saw Jacobsen being cited with some of our other prior outbreaks, concerns with quarantine and isolation during the 2014-2015 response to Ebola. We've seen some of those conversations happening place with Zika in 2016, 17, I think it was. And we've seen that happening farther back when we were worried about swine flu or bird flu. Next slide. So the federal government vests the states or reserves the powers for the states through the US Constitution. And likewise, the state constitution, particularly Maryland, holds those powers to itself, and then it can give those powers to the counties or local agencies, governments, if it wants. And sort of the figurehead of the state power is the governor, and that comes through the Constitution and statutory powers. And what we're seeing, particularly in times of emergencies, we've seen this from snowstorms to hurricanes to 2009 H1N1 outbreak, we're seeing the invocation of governor's emergency powers. And so I wanted to just briefly go over what those powers are, because they're actually quite broad, and sometimes, if you know this, I apologize for the review, but sometimes people aren't aware of how broad they are. So the important thing is it has to be a declared state of emergency. There are some restrictions on what that is. They have to say, why they're declaring it, what powers, which constitutional or statutory powers they're using. But once they have declared a state of emergency or a catastrophic health emergency, Maryland makes a distinction between the two. The governor has the ability to suspend the effect of any statute, rule, or regulation of any agency or any political subdivision of the state, and that means any local governments. The governor has the ability to control the ingress and egress into an area. So when you think about a man-made disaster, like a terrorist attack, or if you're thinking about a tornado, being able to control who can come in and out of those areas, either for investigation purposes or for safety purposes, that makes sense. The governor can control and set transportation routes into affected areas throughout the state. The governor can control the distribution and stockpiling of goods, and that can include setting quotas, setting price limits to prevent gouging, and other things that are related to making sure that goods are being distributed the way that they need to. And it also includes a suite of other powers. There's a lot of financial power that goes with that, so that normal procurement processes can be short-circuited so that you can get money and funding quicker. The governor has the ability to close businesses. He or she can close banks, set curfews, which we've seen happen in the past as well. Next slide. So the catastrophic health emergency is a little bit different, and one of the things that makes it different is the you see the Secretary of the State of Maryland being invoked much more. And what happens here is that the governor can seize immediately anything that's needed to respond to the catastrophic health emergency, and that's the actual text of the statute. So that's a pretty broad power. So that would be, you know, medical supplies and equipment, buildings if necessary, that kind of thing. But then you also see that the governor has the authority to order the Secretary of Maryland Department of Health to conduct things like treatment, vaccination, testing, quarantine and isolation orders, or setting up places for quarantine and isolation orders. A lot of times in Maryland, what we've seen when a governor has declared a state of emergency, there is a broad reference to the Maryland code areas where both of these frameworks are laid out, and so they don't always necessarily say, I am declaring a state of emergency under the Maryland Catastrophic Health Emergency Act or under the Emergency Management Act. They'll invoke both of those statutes, and that allows them to have sort of those combined powers. As someone who works in public health, I would argue it's very difficult to have any kind of emergency that doesn't touch on some kind of public health issue and has the ability to become a public health emergency. So that kind of makes sense to me and from a response perspective. Next slide. Another power that the governor has during a declared state of emergency is the ability to move staff and employees from the state level and the local level to aid in the response. So that can include state employees. It can also include local employees if that's necessary for the response. So moving resources to areas that are harder hit to help with that response. That's something that they have the power to do. And they can also order local law enforcement and health officials to aid in the response as well. So if the governor decides that there is a new regulation or, you know, like with curfew is a good example, the governor issues a curfew order, the local law enforcement is typically asked to help enforce that curfew. And sometimes, you know, the local law enforcement operates under their own rules and regulations and standards, and they answer in a different manner than that typically. So we see that ability to really get all hands on deck and follow the governor's plans. Next slide, please. There are some limits, as I mentioned. There's a time constraint. So any declaration of emergency will expire 30 days after it is declared unless the governor chooses to renew it. There's language in the statutory frameworks that require the responses to be reasonable. So there is some balance on that. It's, you know, there's not unbridled blank check power there. And then if the General Assembly decides that the emergency declaration isn't necessary or that it's gone on too long, they can pass a joint resolution to terminate the emergency. Next slide. So one of the things that we're seeing in the current pandemic is a lot of times what is good for certain locations is not always good for other locations. We see that with states. You know, California was one of the first states to issue a shelter-in-place or stay-at-home order. Missouri and some other states took a lot longer. Some states I don't think ever did issue a stay-at-home order. And so we see that at the federal level, but that's also true at the state level. And we're seeing this particularly now playing out in the South. I'm from Georgia, so basically the South to me is Georgia, Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, maybe South Carolina, maybe North Carolina. But those states, particularly Georgia, Tennessee, and Florida, have announced that they are opening in phased ways starting in May. And so one of the things that we're seeing is this discussion in coastal towns, on beaches, but also in major urban areas like Atlanta, where mayors of cities are saying, we don't think that we're ready to open yet. We have concerns about density. We have concerns about populations. You know, there's more mass transit in urban areas. That's a different concern than some of these more suburban areas where everyone is driving. And so you have seen here, this is the mayor of Tybee Island, which is a beach island down in Georgia. And the mayor there was saying, we don't want our beaches open, even though we rely heavily on tourism. We don't want people to come, and we want to close our beaches. And the governor overrode that and said, we're opening beaches. And so we're seeing this discussion taking place of, you know, those different localities having concerns that may be different from the governor, and how does that happen? Next slide. Well, how does that play out? So the answer is, particularly in a declared state of emergency, the state has the power through the state constitution, and this is specific to Maryland, but most states have this, to override local law. And we call that preemption. So the state law preempts local law, except when the state law, I'm sorry, I can't see my slide right now, but unless there are some sort of extraordinary circumstances, almost always the state law is going to override the local law. And in a state of emergency, that is certainly going to be true. And then again, if it's impossible to comply with the local and the state law is going to preempt that. So, you know, in situations where you might say the beach is closed or the beach is open, if whatever the state is saying is likely to go. Ideally, these are going to be conversations that are occurring between localities and the governor, and working together and trying to get people on the same page so that they're in agreement, or that they have sort of made compromises to meet the needs of their citizens. But from a strictly legal perspective, the state has the power in almost every situation to make the final decisions. Next slide. So one of the asterisks, I would say, one of the caveats to that is the powers that the counties have depend on the form of the county. And again, if you guys are local, then most of you are going to be familiar with this, but Maryland has 3 different kinds of counties: commissioner, charter, and code home rule. And then there's Baltimore City, which is kind of a home rule county structure, but it's its own little, it's its own animal. Generally speaking, all of the counties and Baltimore City have the responsibility and the power to protect the public health, and it's just a matter of how that is expressed through the county code. So if you're a commissioner county, a lot of what your powers, where your powers come from, are from the General Assembly, and they legislate for you. If you're a charter county, you're doing your own legislation. And in counties like Baltimore and Howard County, which are charter counties, you see some of those frameworks for emergency response or declaring local states of emergency that echo the frameworks at the state and federal level. But in all cases, there is a public health power at the county level. A lot of times that's expressed as either a threat to the public health, an urgent threat. So, you know, regardless of the situation, if a county health official sees something that can pose a threat to the public health, they are empowered to act. And then there's also a lot of times in the counties nuisance statutes, and nuisance can be defined very broadly from what we typically think of, like an unkempt pool, high weeds that attract vermin, and then, you know, I always think about pest control because I lived in Baltimore City for a long time. Those can be nuisances, but then nuisances can also, and typically do in the statutes, include language that has that broad language about anything that can present a threat to the public health. Next slide. So we kind of talked about this. If you guys have questions about the counties and the interplay of that, I'm happy to talk more about that, but my guess was that most of you are familiar with your counties and how they work and the interplay of those. But again, I'm happy to talk more about that. This is just another example. Again, this is Tennessee. So the mayor, Andy Burke of Chattanooga, was actively speaking out against Tennessee opening up, and actively said, you know, Chattanooga is not going to open for business. We're not going to open those I can't remember which businesses it was. I think there were restaurants at reduced population, some, hair salons. I know Georgia did bowling alleys. I don't think that was part of Tennessee. What ended up happening was, as you can tell from the headline, his request was denied and the governor sort of overrode that. And so the headline was that he accepts the new order, and Chattanooga did open. So again, the county has a lot of powers in a declared state of emergency. A lot of that is going to be a conversation with the governor or discussions about how that's taking place. And most of that power is going to reside in the state level. Next slide. So that is a fairly quick overview. Like I said, I wanted to give everyone time to ask questions, and I'm happy to field questions now, or Eric, I can start with the questions that were already submitted. Either way is great with me.
Sure, why don't we go ahead with the ones that were submitted in advance,
Sure.
our way through some of those.
So one of the questions that came in was asking about information regarding public messaging and media questions and dealing with HIPAA and other privacy issues. So I think one of the things, from putting a public health hat on perspective, a lot of the messaging is going to be communicating with your localities and regions about the policies that are in place, the importance of those public health measures that we're seeing. Currently, Governor Hogan has required people in public to wear masks. There's a lot of messaging about hand washing. There's a lot of restrictions on where you can go and when you can go. We're in an essential travel order right now. And so all of those messages, that kind of messaging is important to get out to local jurisdictions and explaining that. As regards HIPAA, one of the things that we've seen a lot on the news is reporting about nursing homes. And there were some nursing homes across the state of Maryland that became very large pockets of the virus and had very high fatality rates. And when you're discussing those kinds of issues, HIPAA applies to covered entities, which typically include anyone that offers a health service or is a business associate of someone who offers a health service. So most of the time that will include local health agencies if you provide any kind of health services. If you're not sure, it's better to err on the side of leaving out information. One of the things that I advise is, one of the things I recommend to people when we have this conversation, there's a lot of ways to craft messages that get the important information out without revealing key privacy details. So, areas to avoid, there is some notification requirements that come up, especially in the workplace setting, but making sure that the public is informed without revealing, who the person is, the gender of the person, all of those kinds of things. It takes some work, but public information officers are really great at crafting this. So if you have a public information officer, or if you're in a county whose EOC is activated, working with them to craft that messaging can be a really great resource. Another question was about the planning. And so one of the questions said, there's concern about the planning and the lack of emergency response and plans in order to build upon in the event of public health or other emergencies. And again, I'm not sure who submitted these or what roles you have, but I would say all counties have emergency operations plans, and public health departments, local health departments are also required to have plans. If you're not aware of a plan in your local jurisdiction, then I would recommend reaching out to people who might be able to put you in touch with those, or see if you can get a hold of the plan or talk to people who are involved in the planning. Public health departments, local health departments have all been working on plans, including pandemic planning, since we were worried about bird flu and swine flu. I think bird flu was first back in 2005. And so there are those plans, there are those annexes. It's true that this pandemic is broader than a lot of what we expected to happen in the United States, but it is not uncontemplated. What we're seeing in terms of reduced workforce, absenteeism, closed schools. A lot of people who work in this kind of planning, those are situations that they've talked about. So a lot of times the plans are there, they may not be updated. It might be a question of, is it updated? And until, you know, about 5 months ago, a lot of these questions, including issues of quarantine and isolation and treatment and testing, you know, those are measures that were on the books from 100, 200 years ago before modern medicine evolved. And we're seeing those issues reemerge with emerging infectious diseases because we don't have the treatments for them, we don't have the medicines for them, we don't have the vaccines. And so we're implementing those things like social distancing, quarantine and isolation. And those are actually quite old measures. And so a lot of these questions are kind of outstanding. Well, we don't know, or we didn't know until about 5 months ago, how these measures would look in modern society, because it's been so long since we implemented them. What does that look like in modern society? So I think moving forward, reevaluating those plans, seeing how things played out in practice, that's going to be an absolute necessary step of this. And really thinking about, you know, we tend to think of emergencies as shorter term, right? We have a hurricane that's a week maybe of bad weather, and then we have the response. Even if the response to a hurricane takes 6 weeks, 6 months to rebuild, you know, that the hurricane itself has passed. So we kind of know the steps that are next. This pandemic is different. Epidemiologists agree we're going to be in this for a year and a half. You know, if everything falls into place, as Tony Fauci said, we will have a vaccine by January 2021. And that's a lot of time from now to start thinking about what does our new normal look like. So that a question that sort of goes with that is, what is the role of municipalities in the public health sector, and how can we position ourselves to be a better equipped hub or resource for constituents in ongoing and future times of emergency and disaster response? And this is a great question, and I think it's something that is going to vary somewhat geographically, because, you know, counties have different concerns, regions have different concerns, different demographics. But I think one of the things that we're seeing is questions of supplies, people, you know, needing that personal protective equipment, really messaging. A lot of what I think Maryland and the locals have done a really great job of is communicating with the public and telling them, these are the measures, these are what you should be doing, here's what's available to you. But a question that's come up a lot is food insecurity, making sure that people have food, because, you know, a lot of people aren't able to work, and without working and paychecks, there's a question of where is the food going to come from. Encouraging those hygiene practices. I think there's going to be so many different practices and recommendations that come out of this that we're going to be implementing. It's, in some ways, I think it's almost too soon to say too much about that, but it certainly has put a different lens on the question of community resilience. You know, how do we make our communities stronger, better prepared, so that in the future they're able to, you know, weather these kinds of events if we have these longer term events, or even shorter term. Were there additional questions?
Yeah, I'll start asking some of the questions people have been sharing in chat. So the first one, Jennifer Coates asked, how are a person's religious rights handled in relation to emergency powers? So what's, I guess, the interaction between religious freedom guaranteed under the Constitution and these emergency powers?
Yeah, so that is one, that's a tough one. The short answer is it goes back to that Jacobsen v. Massachusetts. No right is absolute. So as long as religious institutions aren't being targeted, you know, measures that are put in place to protect the public health, if they affect religious organizations, that's likely going to be okay, as long as those organizations aren't being targeted specifically and called out and discriminated against. So I think one of the questions that has come up down in, I want to say Louisiana, Mississippi, were, the stay-at-home orders, and then there were some pastors and churches, and they said, we still want to congregate. And some of the organizations did drive-through churches where they opened up parking lots and people stayed in their cars, and the pastor would do a sermon from a microphone that people could tune into. But again, the state has that vested interest and the vested right to protect the health of its citizens. So as long as it's not targeting those religious organizations, those measures will likely be upheld.
All right, so our next question from Jay Fuller. In relation to limits, I assume that means limits on emergency powers, who has the authority to question the reasonableness of an action or order? Is it only through the joint resolution of the General Assembly to overturn an emergency declaration, or does anyone else have a role?
So I think, without getting too far in the weeds on that, if there was a local jurisdiction that had a question about the reasonableness of it, you can always take that to court to get a decision on it. And we have seen that happening in some jurisdictions. In California, there were some businesses and some cities that disagreed with the state of California, and they actually filed lawsuits to get injunctions so that they didn't have to do those things. So there's always that process to go up through. Ideally, these are going to be conversations that are happening, and resolutions can happen sort of outside of a legal process.
Thank you. And again, to everyone participating, you can add a question if you have a question to the Zoom group chat, and I'll ask it of Trudy. You can access the group chat by clicking the chat button at the bottom of your screen. We have a question from Roy Peterson, who asks, if these rules apply to all states, are protesters in Michigan and other places hoping or planning that they could move a case to the Supreme Court, or just your thoughts in general on protests against gubernatorial declarations?
So that has been one of the really interesting things through all of this. As I said, so much of what we teach and what we talk about in the field that I'm in and what we work on with clients is these outstanding questions. We don't know what they're going to look like when the rubber meets the road on some of these regulations. And we're seeing that coming up now with the stay-at-home and the protesters and the people filing lawsuits. I think in general, as long as the state's orders pass that balancing test, does the necessity of the situation require it, and does that outweigh the individual liberty concerns, then I think we're going to see those things upheld. And again, some of that is going to vary depending on the district that you're in. There are more conservative and more liberal courts, across the country, just as there are more conservative and liberal cities and states and that sort of thing. And those outcomes might be different depending on those makeups. But in terms of, the protesters, I think one of the big questions is, does the state have the right to do this? From Jacobsen v. Massachusetts, I would say yes, as long as it's reasonable. And currently, I think most courts are going to find that the actions are reasonable.
All right, thank you. From Collins R., from your perspective, does a code home rule county have the same authority to establish emergency legislation that a charter county would have? And the question's coming from Charles County, which is code home rule.
So that is something I'm not as sure about. I know code home rule is typically constrained a little bit more than charter counties. Charter has a little bit more freedom in that area, as long as it's not an area that the General Assembly has legislated on for the code home rule. I think that's something that you could look into, but typically I haven't seen a lot of those for the code home rule. So I think that's something that would be a great discussion to have with your local attorneys.
From Nizal, what liability falls on government if a patron contracts the virus while at a government facility, such as a pool or a summer camp or rec center?
Yeah, so I think maybe this was submitted before and I was trying to dodge it, but That is a great question, and that's a really tricky question. And the liability question is one that a lot of attorneys haven't been able to turn their attention to in the response aspect because there's so much response. I think one of the things that's going to happen as states open up, and I'm hoping that Maryland can do this because we have a little bit more time before things are opening. There needs to be a public health messaging that, just because things are opening up, that doesn't mean that the risk is gone. The risk is still exists, and the risk is going to continue to exist for the next year, year and a half, or until we have a vaccine. And so I think if governors are declaring that states should be opening up and those buildings should be opening up, that's likely going to be the protection that you have, right? You're being ordered to open up. But I still think from a public health perspective, there's a lot of messaging that can be done. And there is, I think another part of your question was, employees who can't social distance. So lifeguards, people who work in summer camps with people who have special needs or children who are young and can't do everything for themselves. They can't physically distance themselves and do their job. So are there extra protections for them? And there's not a clear answer for that. I think we're going to see people using, the cloth masks, reusable masks, and that sort of thing to help protect themselves. But in terms of policies and procedures that provide additional protection during this pandemic, that's something we're still kind of waiting to see how it comes out.
All right, thank you very much. Another question that occurs to me, the Attorney General's office has been pursuing, the Attorney General of Maryland has been pursuing price gouging cases. Is there a role for local governments, for counties, municipalities in dealing with price gouging or addressing the issue?
That's a really good question. I think, again, that's something that you can work with the state on. Ideally, you're having these conversations, and I know everyone at the local level is like, we're trying to have conversations, and, it's very hard to have those conversations, so it's easy to throw that out there. Just talk to the state. So I recognize that that's easier said than done in a lot of situations. But it depends, again, on the county and what powers they have in terms of regulation and rules in their county code as to how much they can do to enforce those things.
Well, thank you. And folks, if you have any more questions, feel free to add them in the chat tab. So Trudy, there was another question that came in early, and I don't know if you know the answer to it, that had to do with issues of housing, like rent and mortgages, and the sort of role that counties and municipalities have in addressing housing insecurity that's resulting from COVID, or the recession that we're going to have resulting from COVID. I wonder if you could speak to that at all.
That is something I have very little information on. I know that the governor has issued some executive orders that relate to those things. There's been a lot of talk about that at the federal level as well. How that functions at the local level, I'm sorry, I can't answer that specifically.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. Just have a few more minutes, so if you have any other questions, feel free to ask them in the chat box. In the meantime, I'll share with everyone that's participating that we have been working to create more webinars on topics of concern to local governments related to the COVID pandemic. We just confirmed yesterday that we will be doing a webinar on Friday, the 15th of May, that will be focused on how to deal with the Open Meetings Act in a time where we can't have in-person meetings. So for example, if you're running a meeting like this webinar on Zoom, how do you comply with the Open Meetings Act? And we're working also later towards the last week of the month to do a webinar focused on issues having to do with budget and revenues, given the revenues hits that all of our levels of government are seeing as a result of the pandemic. Trudy, I wonder if you have, I'm not seeing any more questions come in, but any final thoughts to share with the participants regarding these issues?
No, I want to take a minute to thank everyone that's on the call and our responders, from whether you're an emergency responder or whether you're in public health or whether you're at the county executive level. I really think Maryland has done an exemplary job of responding to this. I'm living and breathing and reading this all the time right now, and I'm looking at different states and responses, and I feel very lucky. I feel very blessed. I teach at the University of Maryland School of Law, and I told my students this before the university closed and went to distance learning. I feel very strongly that we're in great hands, and I think that's partially because of all of you guys and all of the work that you're doing, and I really appreciate that. So I want to say thank you.
So we did get another question while
Sure.
I was treading water there. So, so from Lorianne Sales, what are your thoughts regarding the virus and how we're supposed to be tracking asymptomatic individuals? So these issues maybe of tracking and contact tracing.
So that is a really difficult question. I have a whole, I call it my gloom and doom talk that I've done for a couple of other organizations where I sort of talk about what we do and don't know about the virus and how that impacts our planning considerations. And the asymptomatic piece is very tricky, particularly because, and again, this is something Maryland has done an extraordinary job of procuring tests, but we have very limited testing. And so the countries that we've seen that have done really good at shutting down outbreaks of the pandemic are those that have very widespread testing, and that's been a struggle for the United States. And because we know that this virus is asymptomatic and we suspect most cases are asymptomatic, it makes contact tracing very difficult without the widespread testing. And it's doubly difficult because the virus can be transmitted when people are pre-symptomatic, meaning before they develop symptoms. And there's a lot of information and literature coming out that says people may actually be at their height of infectiousness 24 to 48 hours before they develop any symptoms. So when you're best able to pass this virus along, you still feel great. So that combined with the asymptomatic aspect of the virus, I think getting testing, widespread testing is going to be really important to that, because without knowing if you're positive, you can't implement contact tracing or know to implement contact tracing unless someone becomes symptomatic. So again, it's not really a great answer, but the testing is really key to that. The other discussion is for planning implications moving forward, thinking about how you can limit people's bubbles, which is the term that people are using now, who you come into contact with, making sure that you kind of keep that limited. And in doing so, especially in the workplace, either through staggered schedules, a fixed staggered schedule, these 7 people are in this office on Monday and Wednesdays. One of those 7 people came down with the symptom or tested positive. So those 7 people are the people that we need to ask to stay home and keep working from home for the next 7 days, or ask to self-quarantine. It's going to be, until we have the widespread testing and we have a clearer picture of the number of people that have had the virus or have the virus, that contact tracing piece is going to be very difficult. We can still do it through the symptomatic people that we know, but it's going to be tough.
Well, so a related question, I know South Korea, for example, has been making heavy use of cell phone data in tracking interactions of folks and ensuring that people are complying with quarantine and things like that. Is there discussion within the legal community about the legality of that within the United States?
Yeah, that has been a big question, and a lot of newspapers have run articles about, along with this pandemic, there's increased surveillance. There's the discussion of using the apps for contact tracing, and South Korea has used that. China was also using that. And it is sort of an uneasy relationship because it could be very helpful, but in terms of, well, it depends on who's implementing the screening. There are HIPAA concerns, there's just general cybersecurity concerns, and then there are those individual liberty concerns about, who knows where you are, when you are, and why you are in those places, and who you want to know that information. So that is a very big discussion. I think any successful app that comes out is going to be from a health entity likely, and it's going to be one of those what we hear about the crowdsourcing. So people are voluntarily saying, yeah, I'll be a part of this. I'll share this information and where I'm going and where I've been. I think that's the likely most successful way of doing it. I think particularly in the U.S., anything that is not voluntary is going to meet a lot of resistance legally and sort of conversationally.
All right, we have time for just one or two more, and then we have to conclude. Todd Knock says, I've been reading articles about the link between vitamin D deficiency and death by way of COVID. Do you think that this information is credible to put out to citizens? And maybe more generally, where should local officials be looking for information that's credible enough to share with their constituents?
Yeah, so that is another really tough one. And part of the issue with that is there's so much that we don't know, and it can get overwhelming, right, to think about it, because we're not used to having diseases that we don't know how to fight. We didn't know this virus existed 5 months ago. The amount that we know now is tremendous. And so what we're seeing is all of this medical literature coming in, the New England Journal of Medicine and other big medicine journals are publishing letters from doctors who have been working in hospitals. So a lot of the information we're finding is case studies. They're not the peer-reviewed kind of medical, rigorous scientific studies that we're used to seeing that people, conduct for a year, write about for a couple of months. It undergoes all of these panels of reviews and questions, and how did you do this, and how did you, that's not the information we're getting. So we have seen a link between vitamin D and COVID-19. That's a guarded link. We're not sure what that means. Just like we're seeing incidences of stroke in young 30 to 40-year-olds who have no health factors that would be a cause for concern. We're seeing a high incidence of stroke in some of those patients. Now just this last week, the New York Times ran an article about New York City was seeing some cases in children who had COVID-19, and children have typically had very low incidences of, adverse occurrences, but they're seeing some very strange inflammatory disease-like responses in some of those kids. And I think any messaging that you do kind of has to be through the lens of, this is what we know now. This is a very fluid situation. This is changing. Generally, I've seen a lot of messages about eat well, make sure you're exercising, get out in the sun. With the vitamin D issue, it can vary greatly, because if you have good vitamin D absorption, you can stand outside in the sun for 10 minutes and be fine. If you have a deeper complexion, that is not the case. All of the information that's coming in, I think working with public health officials, local medical experts to craft your message is important, because what we know now is very different from what we knew a month ago, from what we knew 2 months ago. And some of those things haven't changed, like the underlying risk factors, lung disease, immunocompromised, heart disease, hypertension, diabetes, some asthma issues. All of those have sort of remained constant, but there's been so many other things that have come up that I think any messaging has to sort of be predicated on, this is what we know now. And threading that with public health so that you don't undermine trust is a tough challenge.
All right, thanks. One final question, then we'll conclude. So we have a question from Jessica about herd immunity. So she's asking, can the herd immunity data, to the extent we have it, be applied by locality so that a state could, for example, differentiate and reopen certain parts of a state because there's more herd immunity in that area than another area? Or is the fact that the virus doesn't respect municipal and county boundaries something that would prevent that?
So I think that's an interesting question. We're hearing a lot about herd immunity and this idea that once a certain level of people have had the disease or been exposed to the disease, it kind of makes it safe for everyone else. The tricky part with that is that by our best estimates, and again, this goes hand in hand with widespread testing, so our numbers are not great. But by the epidemiologist's best estimates, nationwide, about 3 to 4% of the country has had COVID-19. And one of the statistics that we're hearing from people about herd immunity is we need about 60% of the population to have been exposed to the disease. That varies depending on your location and where the outbreaks were. So New York City made a lot of headlines for having, you know, a huge medical surge of COVID-19. But even that city is likely only about 12% of the population has been exposed to or had COVID-19. So even reaching 60% for herd immunity is going to be, we're a long way off from that. But I do think eventually there's going to be this discussion of, you know, this area has had large outbreaks and a lot of people have been exposed to it. But I think you hit the nail on the head in that people travel, they go across county lines, they go across state lines, you know, and in particular in the Maryland region, you can go north, you can go west, you can go south, and you can be in another state faster than some states, you know, you could ever get out of. So I think what we're seeing is that regional approach, and I think that's likely what we're going to see moving forward. But I think herd immunity, I think, is quite a long way off either way, because I personally feel 60% is a pretty low percentage based on what we know from other diseases, which typically require closer to 90 or 95%.
Well, Trudy, this has been fantastic, and really, we very much appreciate you participating and helping everyone learn more about the topic. I don't know if you've seen, but there's been a number of people writing in chat how much they appreciate you being here and how informative this has been. Thank you also to all of our participants. You will be receiving a email with a link to a Google form, which will serve as the webinar evaluation. We could use all the feedback you can provide to us about this webinar. That will also, if you're seeking to get credit from the Academy for participation in this, that evaluation you will need to fill out in order to get that credit. And if you have any follow-up questions, feel free to email us and we'll do our best to provide information. Trudy provided her contact information here for you. So thank you very much to everyone for participating. Stay healthy. Have a wonderful week.
Thank you.